Hello and welcome back to Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. We are here today with Professor Carla Works, who is Dean and Woodrow and Mildred Miller Professor of Biblical Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary. We are so grateful to be here with you to talk today about 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And we wanted to really get started by asking you to just set the stage for us of the relationship between Paul and this community. We'll have these two letters before us, but if you could sort of trace for us the arc of that relationship and describe its character, that'd be a great place to start.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I love talking about First Church Corinth, as I like to call it. But I love this church because it's really just a hot mess.
Oh.
It gives me hope for the church today. I've spoken like a good Methodist here. But Paul's relationship with this church is one that is fraught. I mean, he has invested a lot of time in the Corinthian community. According to Acts, at least 18 months on the ground. But when you're reading these letters, and I love to read them with my students, you can see hints of earlier letters and letters that we may not have any records of. We have two lengthy letters in our New Testament canon, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. But then when you're reading 1 Corinthians 5:9, there's a reference to a letter that he's previously written. Or you turn to the beginning of 2 Corinthians, and there's a reference to a tearful letter and a painful visit. So there's been a lot of back and forth between Paul and this community, and Paul has sent co-workers. So Timothy has gone to First Church Corinth in Paul's absence, and so has Titus. So it's not just about Paul, the Lone Ranger. It is Paul and his whole band of co-workers. And Paul has spent some time trying to help this church grow into its faith. And I help them see the world differently through the lens of the cross. So there's a lot of back and forth between Paul and First Church Corinth.
So what are some of the major issues here? In what ways is this particular church a hot mess?
What are they not arguing about? No, they're arguing about a little bit of everything. But basically, they're trying to figure out how to live out their faith with their everyday life. And we can be very hard on them. Typically, every time I teach this set of letters, the audience does eventually get very hard on First Church Corinth. But in reality, they don't have, Sunday school literature to turn to or other churches that they can go to. This is all very new to them. So they're trying to figure out things like, what do you do when you have someone in your church who clearly has enough power and authority that he can get away with things like sleeping with his stepmom? Or families in the church that are suing one another in the local courts in an age where to sue another family means that you are bringing another household to shame. Or you have disagreements over things like, do we believe in the resurrection? This is a doctrine that doesn't make a lot of sense in this first century context. And so what does it mean to believe in a bodily resurrection? So they're disagreeing over a number of things. And then there are just basic everyday issues of how do we get along with each other when you have people of all walks of life in this one community. How are you even going to sit and have a meal together when you're not used to having conversations with one another? And now you're supposed to love each other. And we know from 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34, that even sitting together at the Lord's Supper, Paul says, this is not even the Lord's table that you're celebrating. There are too many divisions here. So they're divided in a number of ways. They're just trying to figure out how to live faithfully. not unlike the church today.
So we've been trying to see Paul as a pastor and not as this, theologian who sits off in a in a walled-in place, but is really in contact with people. And we've looked at letters where Paul is very warm toward his readers, like Philippians and First Thessalonians. We looked at Galatians, where Paul is pretty fiery. What are the emotions? What are the emotions of this letter? Is he frustrated? Is he kind of being nasty? Is he warm? How would you describe?
I don't think he's being nasty in First Corinthians. I think when we get to Second Corinthians, there are moments where he's like, these super apostles. I think then he takes a turn of being pretty frustrated. But I think in First Corinthians, he really believes this letter is going to work, that he has a solid relationship with this church, and that by grounding all of his advice in the wisdom of the cross, that he's going to center them and remind them of their faith. And then he's going to take up these issues throughout this letter, and that somehow this letter is going to be successful and help bringing unity to the church. And of course, we know it wasn't all that successful because we have Second Corinthians. And there are still divisions in the church. But I think that he really is. I think we're seeing Paul being Pastor Paul, not a theological talking head, but Pastor Paul trying to help them figure out, how do I live out this theology that I say I believe in this word of the cross? But what does that look like? And we see that through some of the imagery that he uses, likening himself, using parental imagery, for instance. There's the image in 1 Corinthians 3 of giving milk. So this nursing imagery. And you pair that with 1 Corinthians 4 and this disciplinarian father type figure who also takes responsibility for the household. So I think we see a little bit of a multifaceted picture of Paul as pastor in this letter.
So how does he ground his sort of pastoral advice or guidance or care for this community in that theology, and specifically that theology of the cross at the beginning, that sort of wisdom and folly? How does he draw those together?
Well, one thing that is overlooked by most of us is that even how he starts the letter, he turns to those who are the least in the congregation and addresses their concerns first. So when you're reading this letter, you can sort of get lost in how many divisions there are, how many issues there are. Clearly, Paul is addressing two different fronts. On one side, the church has written him a letter. We know this because the Bible tells us so. So in 1 Corinthians 7:1, Paul says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." So the church, through, I don't know what kind of charge conference or business meeting they had, but they decided to write Paul on certain issues. But Paul doesn't turn to those until 1 Corinthians chapter 7. That's a lot of letter to sit through, listening, waiting. And in the meantime, Paul addresses matters that he's heard about from Chloe's people. Chloe's people, we don't know a lot about, but this is a common way to refer to slaves of a household. And Chloe's people have told Paul other matters that the church clearly didn't want Paul to know about, like a man who's sleeping with his stepmom, or men who are visiting prostitutes, or people who are suing one another in the local courts. So I think even in the fact that Paul chooses to elevate the voices of the marginalized in the congregation first, would have been an eye-opening way for them to think about this topsy-turvy world of the cross. That from the very beginning of the letter, Paul begins with the word of the cross, but this word of the cross elevates those that the rest of society would have just deemed voiceless. And so I think we see it even in the way the letter is structured and the voices that choose to get elevated.
Mm. Mm.
That's interesting because 1 Corinthians is a little disruptive to read because it feels like it jumps from topic to topic, and some of the topics sound a little strange to our modern ears. Do you have a sense of what holds it together? Is it the cross in general, or is there one big theme, or is this much more of an episodic, now this, now this, now this?
I think the theme is what God has been doing through the power of cross and resurrection to rectify the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that their very world is different. And so all of these pieces that sound so like, here we're going to deal with this issue, and here we're going to deal with this issue. When you step back and look at them as a whole, it's all about how this faith disrupts how we see every facet of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that the cross really changes every part of our interpersonal relationships with one another, of how we're going to carry out our daily lives and even our social lives. Each one of these pieces relates somehow back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and that word of the cross. But it's 1 Corinthians 15 and the power of resurrection that gives that cross so much power, right? So we have these bookends for this letter. And we can't really divorce 1 Corinthians 1 from 1 Corinthians 15 either. But I think that it's the gospel itself that holds this letter together.
That's beautiful. I love that the sort of structure that is embedded in this letter. Matt, did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, because I
Okay.
did as soon as you ended, Carla, where you said it's the gospel itself that holds this letter together. What is the gospel then? What is the good news according to this letter?
I think that for Paul, the gospel is so much bigger than a set of a checklist. You know, we often say you have to believe this, 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 and this. But for Paul, it's what God is doing to rectify and redeem the whole world. And Paul sees that most clearly in God's actions through Christ. And so if God is working through the love of the cross, and that love is embodied in Jesus, then we as followers of Christ should live out that love that we see embodied in Christ.
Yeah.
And I think for the first church Corinth, that kind of love, first of all, is countercultural, just as it is in our culture today. But, you know, we often talk about agape. How many sermons have we heard on agape? But for the New Testament writers to use this term, a term that in the Greek world was used to refer to, you know, the kind of feelings you might have for a beggar, something that you have almost pity or charity with the expectation of nothing in return. And the whole gospel rests on that love. It's pretty fascinating and rich. And we sort of overlook that.
Yeah. And how many sermons have we heard on chapter 13, where the greatest of these is love, and
Yes.
all of those
Or
things?
at a wedding.
Yes.
It has
Exactly.
nothing to do with weddings. I'm so sorry if I offended anyone. But you know, that Paul didn't have any clue about weddings that would be people choosing one another, you know, loving one another. But if the church knew how to love each other, then 1 Corinthians 13 would be a truly beautiful thing to say at a wedding, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Better than what he does say about weddings in chapter 7.
I know.
Yeah. Well, so
That,
I'm kind of hoping we can talk about weddings, or at least about gender and gender relationships in this letter. You know, you've talked about this message of this sort of topsy-turvy world, this sort of disruption of traditions. To what extent is Paul disrupting traditions here, either of gender or of sexual relationships, and to what extent is he reinforcing them? I think this
uh,
can be especially hard sitting in the seats where we're sitting in the present moment. But what do you see Paul doing here with
yeah.
gender and sexuality?
Well, I think we often don't understand what Paul is doing. I love to assign my students to look at 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. I don't assign them to write a full paper on it because they get too upset. I mean, I would encourage anyone who's listening to go read that passage. It will make your blood boil. If you have blood pressure issues, take your medication before reading the passage. It is a passage about what's happening with head coverings during worship. And we get very upset typically in our culture when we read this text. And usually in my class, I won't speak for anyone in your congregation, but in my class every year, I always have women come up to me in tears saying, Paul has just reinforced gender dynamics. I can't believe I have to read Paul's letters for this class. I can't believe that these letters are in the canon. And then, we have in this passage of 1 Corinthians 11, women being told to cover their heads and men not covering their heads because they are related to the glory of God, and women through men being related to the glory of God. And it's very easy in our culture to stop our reading right there. Paul has reinforced gender dynamics. There's a clear way in which women are given one set of instructions, men are given another set of instructions. And getting my students to ask more questions about the text is always a challenge, but that's what I do for a living, right? Asking, well, what does the veil signify in this culture? And when they do some research, they discover that not every female in the first century world was allowed to wear a veil. A veil was a symbol of socioeconomic status. It was a symbol of citizenship. Women who were Roman wives were allowed to wear a veil. And so not every female in First Church Corinth would have been given the legal or social right to wear a veil. In fact, those who were slaves or former slaves would not have been allowed to veil. So their hair would have been uncovered. And so going back and reading that passage, we can tell that there are women who are leading the church, praying and prophesying. Interestingly, just a side note, in 1 Corinthians 11, the issue is not whether women can lead in worship. That's not the issue. The issue is how they're attired when they lead in worship. But we have women who are leading the congregation, praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered, which should tell us that we have women who are slave women, former slaves who are leading the congregation, praying and prophesying. And Paul's advice here is not just countercultural, it could be considered illegal by asking the church to give them authority over their own heads, in verse 10, to veil themselves. In other words, to be treated with the highest dignity and honor that a woman could be treated in the first century world, because to show your hair is a sign of being sexually available. And to be covered was a sign of modesty, of respect, of being treated with human dignity. So ironically, we totally missed the point of 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. This first church, Corinth, had slave women or former slaves who were leading the church, praying and prophesying. And Paul's advice would grant them more dignity than they could ever have in their first century setting. So a text like this should cause us to ask, how are we in our 21st century churches looking for ways to empower those that our culture has marginalized, silenced, abused, left behind? And not just empowering them, but encouraging them to lead our churches from the front. So in some ways, the first century was far ahead of us in some of those respects. Women were actually serving and leading and doing things that we don't often give the first church credit for.
Do we have to ask about chapter 14 then?
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, do we have to say then what's going on in chapter 14?
Well, in chapter 14, we have a couple of verses that get that are in two different places in our manuscript traditions, right? I could, well, I'll tell you a little story. My first day of seminary, I grew up Southern Baptist. So my first day of seminary at one of actually the largest seminary in the world at the time, I had a professor quote this verse to me and tell me to sit by my husband. We were in a Greek class together, and I was the only female in the class. I mean, this seminary had 4,500 students, but I was the only female in the class. And he had me sit by my husband so that if I had any questions, I could ask him then, and it was meant as a kindness, so I didn't have to wait to ask my husband when we got home. And of course, he explained to the class that he was interpreting 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35. I actually thank God for this whole episode and growing up Southern Baptist, because this is what turned me into a Paul scholar. Reading these texts, paying more attention to where they're at, paying more attention to the context. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35 appears in two different places in our manuscript traditions. One, where it is in all of our text in verses 34 and 35, and in other manuscripts at the end of the chapter. And so many scholars have wondered whether or not this is a later addition to the text, because after all, it does sound remarkably like some other text, for instance, 1 Timothy chapter 2, and could have been added by a scribe later. However we're going to interpret it, though, we have women who are praying and prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. So even if you think Paul added a marginal note and scribes didn't know where to put it, then it would have to be women who are posing a particular problem instead of a mandate for all women across time, because Paul would be contradicting himself in what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So either way, unfortunately, church history has taken 1 Corinthians 14 as the end all be all and forgotten about chapter 11. But in reality, chapter 11 is in all of our manuscripts.
Well, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That sounds like a distressing experience, and I'm also grateful that you were led into a life of Pauline scholarship, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we're looking to unpack. Really appreciate that. Yeah, Matt, I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Do you have something that you're itching to talk about here? I don't want to turn us to 2 Corinthians prematurely.
No, you go ahead if you've got one.
Okay. Well, I mean, I do think we should touch on Second Corinthians at some point. Before we leave First Corinthians, though, this body as a metaphor. I think that you've named the love passage as something people have probably heard before. They've also probably heard the body of Christ metaphor, the individual, the gifts of people and how they work together. What's that doing in this? What's that sort of metaphor of a body doing here in this
Yeah.
letter?
In many ways, Paul is being a great rhetorician. I mean, you can turn to other writers of the day. This is a popular metaphor because it will preach.
Mhm.
People can understand it quite easily. I love to take groups and actually go to Corinth. If you visit that area, you'll even be able to see a museum where people have gone to the local temple, the Asclepian, which is the temple to the god of healing, Asclepius, and leave votive offerings of clay offerings of body parts, right? Because in the first century world, they don't have access to modern medicine. And so this kind of metaphor will really preach. People understand what it's like to not have part of your body functioning properly. And so Paul's using this to show that we all have these gifts. And it's not that one particular gift is somehow superior in the sense of everybody needs to be the teacher, but that God is putting all of us together. And this is God's church. And God is equipping each one of us with certain gifts that this body needs to function. And in so many ways, if we would step back and value what others bring to this body, that itself would be remarkable, wouldn't it? But often we look at what another person brings, one talent that they have, and that can be a time of jealousy or, oh, I wish I had that gift. And we downplay the God-given gifts that we have. But in reality, this metaphor still works. We can still understand it. It really is trying to reframe an argument in the first century about which spiritual gifts should get more playtime in worship. So worship wars and what should happen in worship is nothing new. It's 2,000 years old.
Yeah. No. Okay. I see why you call this First Church Corinth. That
Yes.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, but we only have a couple of minutes left, and I think we were more sort of interested in going deep on First Corinthians than Second Corinthians. But could you let us know just sort of what will we maybe give us a sort of greatest hit of Second Corinthians, something we should be on the lookout for there?
Well, I think what impresses me the most about Second Corinthians, I mean, first of all, when you're reading it, to me, it does seem a bit more jarring. Either Paul has written this in different settings across time, or perhaps we have multiple letters that at some point got spliced together. But just Paul's certitude that God has given us this ministry of reconciliation, that no matter what, this church, with all of its problems and all of its faults, all of its failings to carry out this gospel, that God sees so much in all of these individuals, that God has made First Church Corinth and the church today God's ambassadors to the world. And that we, through God's Holy Spirit, have this ministry of reconciliation. I just find that incredibly humbling and inspiring when I read these letters.
Well, thank you for lifting that out for us. That's a beautiful note to end on. And thank you so much for this conversation. We really, really appreciate your time with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Carla.